Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Capgemini's Build Tech Talks. My name is Gabriel Moawad, and I will be your host during this edition. Today, we have two tech talks, which for me as a front-end developer myself are really exciting, because we will focus on front-end collaboration in an enterprise environment. First of all, Sven van Straalen will discuss micro frontends with Vue, Azure, and LitElement. The second session, Ryan Kool will talk about Storybook in Angular. Two concepts which definitely have their added value in collaborating with fellow frontenders. We would have loved to welcome everybody inside our office, so we could have presented this face-to-face. Unfortunately, due to the current pandemic, these things aren't possible. Therefore, we weren't able to do so either. In the future, we do plan to present both at our office as well as virtually. But for the time being, I must refer you all to your own kitchens if you want a snack or anything to drink. But let's not drift off. Sven is ready to go and tell us everything about his micro frontend setup. If you have any questions about the presentation, feel free to drop these in the chat, and I'll make a selection of these, and we'll make sure to ask them to Sven after his presentation. That being said, I see Sven already popped up on the screen, so
Hello.
I guess you're ready to go?
I'm good. I'm ready.
Okay, sure. Let's get blown away about your beautiful micro frontends. The floor is yours.
Okay, here we go. Welcome everybody. So the web is changing faster and faster. We are currently already on 5G. What was a perfect idea back then, let's say Internet Explorer, is basically due to change and innovation, not anymore. And basically, big enterprises can't keep up. And a big company means a big app, means lots of developers, lots of opinions. And in a combination with the monorepo results in lots of review comments, lots of pull requests. And yes, these were my pull requests that I had on my name. Bottleneck teams. I was one of the bottleneck teams. A lot of unit test cases, a lot of integration test cases, which were okay, but it immediately resulted in long waiting times in the pipelines. And of course, then the slow upgrades of tooling. And then you had all one-step moment. You needed to change something fast. It needed to go to production fast. And then that other team eventually decided also to put something in fast and eventually you need to revert back. And then you're sitting there, 5 o'clock, ready to go home. You need to still change and roll back all the changes you have done. So let's see how we can help enterprise change faster and to have a happy life as a front-end developer. So we're going to do that with micro frontends. My name is Sven van Straalen. I started in Capgemini as a young professional, now a solution architect, lead developer, coach, delegate, you name it, I'm doing it. In my private time, I DJ, hack some weird stuff, and for sports mountain biking. In the COVID-19 situation, my nice new hobby is maintaining a vegetable garden. You have to do something, right? So what we are going to discuss, we're going to have a quick look at micro frontends. We're going to solve some cons that there are there in micro frontends. We're going to discuss the hosting pattern that we are using. And of course, a demo. And that's going to be a try-catch situation, of course. And then I also have some lessons learned left so that you know what kind of mistakes we made and how you can resolve them. The micro frontends. It started all when ThoughtWorks put it on her tech radar in 2016. It immediately became a hype, and it's also known as the microservices pattern for front-end, which is already known a bit better for a lot of people, where we just slice up our big monoliths, our big applications into smaller ones. There are a few variations of these micro frontends. You have one that's called the Meta framework. It's basically a framework wrapped around the one that's already there. And then you can inject all kind of other frameworks. The multiple SPAs on different URLs is the one that we are going to look at. iframes, that's basically you inject as many as possible of iframes to put everything inside. And if you eventually end up with having iframes in iframes, that can be a mess with testing. Modules communicating with an event bus is one of a nice ones as well. Basically, everyone creates the node modules, and then eventually they're wrapped around together with a different tooling or something. And you have the black box components. Black box components you can basically see as components that are on their own, working on their own. So they also call the APIs on their own and all these kind of things. It's a kind of similar thing that you can see on the right at this moment. The benefits of micro frontends is the scalability, which because every small part of the application, you can just make an addition with an extra team, with a separate pipeline, and moving with incremental upgrades. You immediately have autonomous teams because they focus on one specific part of your website, and they can deploy independently. Those are the definite basic things that definitely help moving forward for an enterprise. And of course, DevOps is then very happy with you because you can focus and your scope is only on a specific part of your application, and the team is immediately in control of what their goal is. But there are some cons. Basically, one of the biggest cons that is there is the island issue. The micro frontend teams that we saw in the days that we are working with it, they work for their own, they have their own scope and their own priorities, which is fine, of course. But the computer contribution model changes that we are not helping each other anymore. And also that makes it immediately harder to share some information or share code between them. Consistency is also then one of them, because we have probably different UX designers with all have different mindsets, and we also have different developers working in different way. The consistency of the interaction of the website can change, and that can change per page or whatever in which micro frontend you choose. The code quality is also a thing. Normally, when you have a monolith, everyone uses the standards because it's actually set in stone already in the monolith itself, and everyone here gets control about what kind of code quality you want. And of course, the developer exchangeability. Let's say if you have multiple frameworks in your micro frontends, and diehard React developer probably doesn't know anything about Angular, and there you also need to take care of. Let's see how we fix those cons. One of the biggest one, the island issue, is fixed with some cool stuff. Communities, guilds, meetups, all come together and share knowledge. These are the most things. A common goal is also very important. Here you see a picture where we sit together and basically have one common goal, and that's the little fellow you can see also in the screen. This is Capman, basically for a game. But we do share knowledge here, and this is also needed to make these micro frontends work, because you need to work together in the micro frontend world to share whatever you are doing. Guild meetings are quite important in this one as well. You can point them out to a specific topic. Let's say some creating standards in how you are going to create your applications and these kind of things, to make sure that everyone is using the similar way of programming. An internal Stack Overflow can help in this one as well, because if you can use, of course, also Stack Overflow itself. But if you want to share code or questions that are should be internal for that enterprise, then an internal one is better to use. The developer exchangeability is also a con, and to fix that, stick to the same language. This is basically one of the easiest parts. You don't want to have context switching too much, because the workflow of your developer, you want to keep that always in the same world, how it's being working. Use the same standards. So those guilds are very, very important to create those standards, and that everybody agrees upon to use those. Using one framework helps. I said, okay, you can basically say that you are going to use multiple frameworks. This is definitely possible, and that's also what I'm going to show. But if you use only one framework, the exchangeability of the developers is easier, because they know how the framework already works, and they don't have to learn a new framework on that moment. Boilerplates and generators can help in this one. If you already create an easy way to start your project, then it's also high. Then developers will eventually tend to use that, because they can really immediately start and focusing on the stuff that they really love, developing these functionalities. keep everything up to date, duh. But basically, we already know Vue 3 came out. This is something we are highly focusing on now. And we like to use Vue.js for our micro frontends. You need to keep those tooling up to date. Two things: retention. You want the developers to stay on board, and the new stuff that comes out, it will eventually end up also on websites and this kind of thing where they get the information and it improves your standards. Internal Stack Overflow, I already talked about this one. The consistency of the website is also quite important for UX, and how to maintain that is basically by reusable components. So you want to make sure that all the components that you have, that everyone is able to use them. How to do that? Make them framework agnostic. So if you eventually want to move to a new framework, or eventually you need to do an upgrade, most of the time these components probably end up being incompatible with the newer version. LitElement is a nice one to use in this case because they are framework agnostic and can be used in any framework. A design system that is highly recommended for this one as well, because you need to share which components are already there so that no one is going to reinvent the wheel. And the style guide is there also needed, but also copyright guidelines and a sandboxing environment. This is something also where Ryan eventually is going to talk about with Storybook. And determine the important components itself. And here there is a nice thing from Brad Frost. It's called Atomic Design. This can help in determining some of the components that are highly important to make sure that everyone has to be up to date for these two. You can see there's a difference in what kind of component you have. So let's say a button, if it's yellow or red, it's still okay. But for the header, for example, you want to make sure that it's always consistent everywhere on the page. And to do that, you have to have those kind of components in a separate way of working than all the others. So to get back on atomic design, you can define your components in a certain way. So normally you have atoms, and atoms are very tiny, small components that on their own doesn't make any sense. But if you combine them together, they become molecules and they become more interesting. Think of a label together with an input field, and it says something. The label says something about the input field. And then you eventually have organisms, where it basically becomes a bit bigger. It maybe has some logic inside and does some validation or whatever. Templates, well, you can see those as the boilerplates. And of course, the pages filled with information. And now to see that in practice, here I have one of my favorite websites, dev.io. And here we have an atom. It's very small, very tiny. And basically is an A label. Yeah, there's no rocket science here. It becomes interesting when you combine a few things in here. So this is the molecule, where you basically have a nice gravatar icon with the label and the date. It says something already about actually the blog post that's standing there. And then, of course, you have the organism. This is all combined molecules together to make it a real contextual situation. And these, on the different landscapes of the application, doesn't matter that much if they look a bit different. But one that's quite important, that is the header in this case. That needs to be the same everywhere, because you don't want to end up with different links everywhere. To do this, we came up with a solution that's called runtime organisms. We called it runtime organisms basically because these parts are the web components that are loaded in runtime. So whenever the user goes to your website, all the others are come together in a bundled way with Webpack, for example, except for the runtime component. That one is being separately loaded. All right, and we have here the page, and then eventually this is the template. To maintain code quality, we automate as much as possible. We do this with pipelines, of course, and use Azure DevOps, which I'm going to show as well. One of the most important thing here is you have to set up those ground rules, and you have to make them in a way that ESLint and SonarQube are able to see those ground rules, so that whenever developers start developing, that automatically it's being verified against those rules. Also, you want to have a lot of enterprise companies, they have like these private NPM repositories like Verdaccio, Nexus, or Azure artifacts. These are highly recommended if you want to scope it, and it has to be kind of a closed software. If you want to open source this, NPM is of course your guy. For testing tooling, we use Source Labs, Tascafé, Cypress, whatever. All needed to make sure you keep the code quality up to standards. Okay, how do we host these stuff? So eventually, now we have nice application, all working local, going through a pipeline with a build. But how do we end it up on the website itself? So we are using a pattern that's called static hosting. It's basically derived from Jamstack. Jamstack is a way of working where you generate a complete static site. But here we are not generating the static site with Markdown and these kind of things. But what we do, we create still these single page applications, but they are quite small. These are the mini SPAs, also micro frontends. The cool stuff about this is that these mini SPAs, they end up in one of these things that are called the blob storages from Azure. You can see them at the bottom. These blob storages are basically USB flash drive with a web server. They don't do anything. They are PaaS, and PaaS means platform as a service, where you basically Microsoft maintains everything that is actually there, and you only have to care about the code. We have something that's called the front door service or the application gateway that can route on a specific URL to your blob storage, to your web server. And so if you have here, for example, coolsite.com that comes with the DNS, then let's say the front door service will point to /mycoolapp/ whatever. That's all up to you. And then the blob storage will serve out your front-end application. And that's the same for API. There, of course, can be all your backend APIs. I leave it now for as a black box. Also, there is one important part in this one, and that's the shared and the library. The library is, of course, for things like jQuery or whatever you want to have cached multiple times. And shared is where you have these runtime organisms. Because these runtime organisms need to be deployed and everyone needs to point to those. You want to have them in a shared environment where everybody is able to reach them. And that's also going to show in the demo if it works. So in conjunction, from dev minds to production, first we generate some stuff, and then we have our workable solution, so where we are going to create our new value. Eventually, we're going to get through the pipeline with Azure DevOps, see if everything's up to date, test everything, and so on. And then it eventually ships it to our production environment. And then we see this on the blob storage. So let's try it out. Here, as you can see, is my nice micro frontend. We keep it as basic as possible for now. We have a nice React of a Vue page, we have a nice React page, and we have a nice Angular page. They are basically small generated, and yeah, quite fair. They are fair simple. So I can show you as well. Over here we have Vue working, and here we have React, and we have Angular. Is this visible? Let me bump it up. Oh, never mind. Here we go. This is much better. Let's see for React and for Vue. So how the pattern eventually works. Here we have our Azure DevOps environment, and let's do a change to the web component. This is basically the header on top of here. So as you can see here, this is a nice shadow root. So we are using LitElement inside, which is a basic navbar. But let's add a logo to it. So what here we go. So what I will do, I'm going to change this one. I'll add this logo. super rocket science of this code, of course. Commit. Yeah. Fine with that. And let's see if the pipeline, yes, the pipeline is running. In the meantime, I will show you around in Azure. So here we have our resource group, and we have some nice blob storages. So these are the web servers again. If we go to web page 1 blob storage and go to the storage explorer, inside here you can see here's our Vue JS environment. So we can change this, and then Vue will be updated. If we have time, then we can probably do this. And for web page 2, this is React. Different folder structure I saw when I generated it, looks a bit different. And for Angular itself. This is also quite nice to test out some performance thingies. We saw that Angular was a bit slower, but yeah, never mind. And we have the most important one in this case. These are our runtime components. This is the shared, where we can see our blob storage and a nice index HTML, or actually the element. I deployed a new latest one on this morning. Let's see, the pipeline is still running. So in the meantime, I can show you the front door service. So we have these, let's say, web service, and you want to combine those things together to make it a real website. So we have here our domain, and then we have our backend pools. As you can see, what I've done is basically, well, I named it web1, point to the blob storage. I've used also the secondary link there. Blob storage always gets 2 links. And then I add an index path, and this is basically for the health probe. You can also disable this, but it's cool to have some load balancing on your blob storage. Yeah. And then eventually you can have a routing rule where if the pattern match 1, then it will point to that blob storage. And that's basically it. Let's see if the pipeline is almost done, I think. Let's see what's happening. Oh, it's still installing dependencies. Well, that doesn't matter, because then I can show you one thing more, which I almost forgot, and that is how do we actually load this web component, because that's the part where it's going to be what makes it runtime. And that's fairly easy. As you can see in this one, I'll bump it up a bit more. Here we go. I basically do an import type module, and then I import that script just from /shared myelement.js. This is just browser how it works. And that's actually making these runtime components. One thing to keep in mind, if you are having some interfaces in these web components, you want to make sure to have that always backwards compatible, because you are deploying independently, and it could risk that teams that are connecting to you with your interfaces, that if it's not backwards compatible, that their applications break. So these, and let's say header teams or these runtime organism teams, they have a extra thing to keep in mind. Well, we see that the deployment is going on now to Azure DevOps of the Azure Blob Storage. Normally it doesn't take that long. Here we go, finished and done. So probably I have to remove the cache. And here you go. We have a nice logo without deploying all the other applications. And the header is changed. So our lessons learned. What we figured out along the way is that web components with the shadow DOM are a pain to test. So unit testing is going fine, but integration testing with Test Cafe or Cypress, the selectors to select the shadow root and these kind of things is quite hard to do, or you will end up with very big queries where you have like these query selectors with shadow root, and then if you have web component inside a web component, you will have multiple times that shadow root to go through, which is making very long statements. They aren't pretty. Versioning in web components can be tricky. Basically, if multiple people are using different versions of these web components on the same page and they register them, then the web component itself will start to fail. A nice solution for this one is to I will get back to that one. I know it, but I forgot it now. A component library is quite important. This basically is to make sure that everyone knows these components. And the static hosting pattern is quite hard to explain to CISO departments. And basically, scoped elements. Sorry, guys. Here we go. I got it now. So if you want to make multiple versions on a web component, you can use scoped elements. And just Google it, and this can help you. CISO departments are still thinking in a way of virtual machines. And due to the past solutions, you don't have to maintain all these kind of VMs or containers or whatever. And so the security is much less than they expect. This takes quite a long time to get them convinced in this one. Also, what we saw in these enterprises is that the contributions of the teams is quite low because they have their own backlog, of course. And so you want to get them in that contributor mindset that they are also going to help in creating components and these kind of things, which so time to time is quite struggling to get everyone on board in this situation. Guilds and meetups, they can help in these kind of things, and they are definitely needed to have. And I think one of these meetups that we are having right now is key in these kind of things. And the transition is quite slow. So micro frontend on its own is, if you eventually are there, it's quite fast for deployments, and you can fast change stuff. But actually moving to a micro frontend from your monolith, dividing up the applications and these kind of things, that happens in a very long pace. So there you have to stick your head out, stick around, and eventually we'll be there in this nice architecture. Thanks for listening to my talk. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. And that was it.
Cool. Thank you, Sven. First of all, you're not getting off that easy because, of course, there are a lot of questions. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, first of all, I saw a question from Renee asking about web components, but I guess the next slide of you was LitElements. Later, Daniel joined in about that question and asked why LitElements instead of Stencil.js, as LitElement is slowly dying.
Yeah, I agree. It seems that LitElement is slowly dying. Well, but I think Stencil was, when we started working on this architecture, was not around yet. So we're working on this one, and I know that Stencil is, I think, still working only on a compiler way of working. So it basically gives also a generic component, but I don't know if it's already possible to encapsulate it as an let's say black box version of it. But that I have to look up actually.
Always improving, right? I saw another question from newlywed Florian. Congratulations still. He asked, do you host all versions of possibly used components on the blob storage?
Not for, let's say, the micro frontend, so not the Vue apps, but for the LitElements, the runtime components, we tend to do. But we want to have kind of a migration strategy. So we, I don't have a slide for that one actually. So what we do inside the blob storage is you will have these versions, but only the major version will be there, because patch and patch and hotfixes, these things can be done easily and should not break. And when you have a breaking change, that will actually end up in a new version of the blob storage. But the rest, that those improvements can be done. But let's say if you eventually have version 1 and people must move to version 2, but it actually has a breaking change, we have like kind of a slack period of let's say 2 sprints. And on that moment, people need to migrate to have that breaking change fixed, and then eventually only V2 will exist. But this is still a work in progress. We are trying this out still.
Cool. Let me see. Bart Kooijman also has a question about the blob storage, but it's more about server-side rendering. So how do you perform server-side rendering if you deploy the blob storage?
Not. There is no server-side rendering in a blob storage. If you want to, a thing what can help here is, so you have this front door service or an application gateway. Let's say if you have some real static assets, and because of the SPAs, they are doing all kind of things client side, and they just call the APIs. So they run a full blown single page application. If you want to use server-side rendering like Nuxt or these kind of things, you need to have an actual machine or app service to do these kind of things. So because there is some computing power needed. Blob storage just doesn't have any computing power. It's basically a USB flash drive.
Clear for me. I hope also for Bart. And then the last one, it's not really a question, but I think you have some ideas about it. It's from Konstantinos, who mentions a good challenge would also be to exchange data between these different micro frontends, some sort of state management between different apps. Did you encounter something like that already, or?
We are actually working on this right now. We got the request where let's say multiple components need to exchange some data, or basically 2 apps are calling the same API service. So you can just do it once because it will respond the same thing. And we are actually tinkering here in using something like an event bus or a node module that is shared along these applications, or a node module as an event bus that can be shared along, and then you can share those data between them.
Cool. Yeah, I think, like you said yourself, there's still a lot of things to discover probably.
Yeah.
But if it's there, it's a good starting point, right? So I'd like to thank you for your presentation and answering these questions. I see a lot of comments thanking you in the comments as well.
Cool.
So it's not only me
Thank you,
thanking
guys. I have a question actually for the audience. Where are they all from?
A bit of user interaction. Great.
Yeah.
Skills, Sven.
Well, I am not seeing anything happening.
I see something popping up, but okay. Well,
never mind. Okay. Yeah, Utrecht.
So Stoffer, a Dusty, shout out to you. Well, it's time for our next presenter, who's also really ready to go. And like you already said, with a little bridge in there, it's going to be about design systems, which also really link up well with these types of micro frontends, of course, as it aligns with the consistency you preached about. So I'd like to welcome to the virtual stage Ryan Kool.
Hello, Gabriel.
Hey, Ryan.
There he is. By the way, I see a lot of people now saying where they're from. I even see some people from Spain and India and Denmark.
Cool.
So we're really international today. Ryan is in Amersfoort, I believe.
Yes, I am.
And it's not as
Amersfoort as well.
Yeah, I see another one indeed. Well, like I said, you're going to give a bit of a talk about design systems. and Storybook in particular. Yeah, I would say the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I will share my screen. I hope everybody can see this. So yeah, my presentation is going to be about Storybook and Angular in combination with Angular 8 Plus. Why do I say Angular 8 Plus? Is because, well, we're working on it with Angular 8, but we encountered problems with Angular 8 Plus. Today's content will be my introduction. I will first tell you a little bit about myself, then I will share some insights about what reusable components are. I'll share some insights on Storybook. I will, of course, give you a little demo. After that are some pros and cons, and then we will handle all the questions you guys or girls might have. So this is me. On the right side, you can see some nice pictures of me. My name is Ryan Kool. I'm 30 years old. I live in Amersfoort, as Gabriël already announced. Some of the things I really like doing, I like skating, I like scouting, I like snowboarding, windsurfing, basically any kind of adrenaline-driven sport. And I even play a little bit of guitar if I feel like it. I must say, I was hoping during COVID I would play a lot of guitar, but it's been more Netflix and chill than guitar. So this is my career. The last 8.5 years I've been working at Capgemini as a front-end developer. I've worked for different kind of companies. I've been working for Dynalean, ABN AMRO. I worked in Canada for 6 months. I worked in India for 3 months. And the last year I've been working for the Dutch police, and I'm still working there at the moment. I've also been a freelancer for almost a year, which was also a good experience to have before you start off in a company like Capgemini. So let's dig into the details. So what are reusable components? So Sven already talked a little bit about these reusable components, but I'm going to deep dive a little bit on this. So imagine you have 2 applications called Shoopy and Stocky, like you can see in this picture. And they share this product list. They have exactly the same product list. It's being used on the same application, but it has different data. But the way it's displayed, the way it looks, the way it's used is all the same, but just the data of Stocky and Shoopy are different. And this is when you get a component that can be reused. So this is what we call a reusable component, a component that's being used multiple times amongst one application in the same kind of way. Even within this product list, you could recognize multiple other reusable components. As you can see, the green blobs in there are all the same size, same distance, and they probably resemble a input field or a button or a label that is being reused within this reusable component. So even within reusable components, you could have multiple layers of reusable components, which makes it, well, not necessarily easier, but at least a lot reusable. So why do we need these reusable components? So if you look at this, picture, you'll see app A and app B both use 3 components, but they use 3 different components. So app A uses the button and the slider and the spinner, and app B uses the navbar, the slider and the spinner. But both the slider and the spinner are being used in both applications. So if you would go back to not using reusable components, you would see that the development team building app A would probably build their own slider, build their own spinner, give it their own UI, give it their own way of working. And app B would probably do the same. They build their own slider, their own spinner, and their own navbar, which is actually kind of a waste because you're not only building it twice, which takes a lot of time, you're also maintaining it twice, and you're also giving the customer of app A and app B, which probably are 2 applications within one company, a different customer experience, which is not something you really want. So to solve that, to go back to this, to solve that, we use shared components, and those shared components they get drawn from a library in which this library reuses all these components. As you can see here, the navbar, the button, slider, and the spinner are all contained within the shared components library, and both app A and app B can use these components without having to build them and maintain them themselves. So how do we distinguish what is a reusable component? So this is quite a difficult question, even if it sounds easy enough, because a lot of people ask me, when is something reusable? When should it be in the component library? When should it be there? There's not really an easy answer. This is one of the answers I found on the internet, but it's not really true as well, because a component with complex logic in nature should not be a reusable component, because the logic will probably change from place to place where it's being used. And if you try to make that component reusable, it probably will not really help. A component without complex logic is almost always a reusable component. But if you don't reuse that component anywhere else, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to make it reusable. There might be some extra work or overhead or etc. or maintainability made by making it reusable if you're not using it anywhere else. So one of the other ways I always like to say is to just see as you go, right? You start building a component and you build an application. And if you need that component again anywhere else, you just drop it out, make it reusable, and then share it. The problem with that statement is, of course, that you don't know what's happening, right? If we were talking about big enterprises and there's 20 teams in 20 different locations, nowadays 200 different locations because everybody's sitting at home, building applications, not knowing what the other people are doing, you don't really know what components are being reused, right? You don't know if I build a component that somebody else needs that component as well. So it's not always a good way to do. What I would suggest is one of the best ways I think is have at least a generic UX or UX center where everybody delivers their user experience designs in, and you can look at those those UX guidelines and then divide and decide what are the reusable components and to what level you should do it. Because I think by doing that, you have the first-hand grip on it. People know it before they start building it because they get the design, and before the design's been finalized, you already recognize which of the components should be reusable or should be made reusable. I think that's quite a nice way. For people who are missing, by the way, the reason why I said components with complex logic could be a reusable component as well. A good example is, for example, when I used to work with Sven at a big banking company, they had a login screen, and the login screen is actually quite a complex component. It's not something easy. It has a lot of data transfer, a lot of protocols, a lot of security in place, and it's a massive component which takes a lot of developing to make it right. But it is actually a reusable component because that login screen could be used on multiple pages, on multiple scenarios, to log in, to upgrade your login, to whatever, right? So even in that case, it's a component with a lot of complex logic, but it's still a reusable component. So then we come to this other cool thing, right? We now know what reusable components are, but what are we going to do with them? And then Storybooks comes in. So this is, this video is actually quite a look of Storybook. It shows you what Storybook looks like. And Storybook is nothing more, and also a lot more, than just a website showing all these components that are reusable. So in this thing, you see on the left side some of the reusable components. And on the canvas, it displays what it looks like. And I'll go into this in detail more later. So why should we use Storybook? Why Storybook? What does this add for us as a company? Why could we not just make reusable components, throw them in some Git repo somewhere, and then use that? So the first reason is we need to visualize what has been built. I've seen a lot of companies where they already built reusable components and they didn't visualize it. And what happened in the end is that a lot of developers still rebuild those components because they just didn't know they exist. If it's not visual, if you can't find them, you don't know what they look like, or you have to check them out yourself and have to take a lot of hassle to find out what they look like and what they could do for you. You're probably going to think to yourself, why would I bother? I'll just quickly build it myself, especially if it's as easy as a button or something like that, right? If it's a complex application part where you really need a lot of data and insights, well, of course, you might go look for it before you start building it yourself. But if it's just a button, you'd probably be off building the button thinking it's easier to do it yourself than to figure out where the hell they put that thing. So another cool thing about this Storybook, except for the fact that it visualizes your components, is that it also comes with documentation. It gives you out-of-the-box documentation. You don't even need to write code to document it. It already reads your code and auto-generates documentation out of it. You can add to that. You can improve on that. You can even add different plugins to it to make documentation look more like the way you would like to look. And you can even do it in file sizes like Markdown, which is reusable over multiple platforms. So you could publish your documentation in Storybook and publish it on your other accounts or your other websites or wherever you want to reuse that. The cool thing that Storybooks comes out of the box with is as well is configuration possibility. So the configuration means that if you have a component, your component will always have some inputs and some outputs, right? So if you get like a button, you'll probably have some kind of label on your button, or it might have different sizes or different colors. And by using the configuration tools in Storybook, it tells you like, hey, this this button has an option of a label. If you change the text in this label, it will display it on the screen. If you want to change the color of this button, we can do it already in Storybook. And it gives you a nice grasp and feel, especially for UX designers, on how to use certain components and what is the range of possibilities of this component. One other thing is out-of-the-box navigation. It comes with out-of-the-box navigation, so you don't have to build the navigation yourself. Before we started using Storybook, we built our own kind of Storybook, our own kind of web component library website. It was a lot of work, it was a lot of maintenance, and we tried to do some smart things as well by auto-generating the navigation and stuff like that. But you always end up making some small mistakes, or it's not perfect yet. It just didn't work as easy as it does in Storybook, and it took a lot of time to develop. And last but certainly not least, is Storybook is an enabler for testing, because you get what Storybook automatically gives you is for every component in every kind of state you can imagine. You can pop it open in your Storybook, but you can also pop it open in an iframe, because everything you see in the Storybook frame is an iframe. The cool thing about this is you can do stuff like UI testing, where you just take a snapshot of that UI in that state and compare it the next time you rebuild. I'll show you something in the demo of that. So then I've got my Storybook, but what should it deliver, right? What does this Storybook do? So one of the things you saw already is this static website. So what Storybook out of the box does, it gives you this static website. So you just say Storybook build, and it automatically generates everything you built and you see in your website. Creates a nice package out of that with some HTML, some JavaScript, some CSS, and you can just display. You can just host that on any static website hosting, and you've got your visual identity ready for people to see. But an important next step is a library package to your repository, for example, to npm or to Nexus or wherever you want to host your package. But it's very important that you also not only display it physically, basically the physical view of the components, but it's also handy that people can actually interact with it, so they can import it or install it or whatever way you want to use this package, but at least then you get the technical code behind the package. So these two things are always your export, basically, from your Storybook application. You could do it in two ways. You can decide to make one repo where you host your Storybook and your package, and you bundle them in two sizes and send them out to different peers. But you could also separate them. You could also make your Storybook application on its own, and in the Storybook application, import the packages that you are running in some other kind of pipeline. So demo time. So what I used is just the basic, for this demo at least. I used the basic Storybook docs Angular get started install, which is the way of installing Angular with Storybook. And if I'm not mistaken, it should be in the comments at this moment. So if you want to look at it, you can look at it later. I will show you some demos first. So when you look at it, like I said, this is what you get. When you open Storybook for the first time, if you do the install, you probably get this, pretty much like this. You get the button, the head of the page. The reactive input is something I built myself. And it already looks pretty nice out of the box. You get awesome features like you can magnify, you can change the view, right? If I go to the button, if I want to show it in the dark view, what does it look like? What does it look like in a light view? What does it look like in a white background? I can show a grid. I can make multiple viewports. It has nice features like this, right? And like I showed you, it comes with out-of-the-box navigation. On the left side, you already see my button in all the different types of manners it comes. You see the header, which is a combination of the button, like Sven already told about atomic design. This is like an atom in this case, and this would be like a molecule. You could even add it to a page where they all comes together, where they add a header and some content. Right? It comes out of the box with docs. This is auto-generated. I didn't do anything to build this documentation, which it gives me insights on what it looks like, which I already had. Gives me insights on all the button inputs. Let's go to the button one. So I know that you can change the background color. You can change whether it's primary or not. You can change the label. You can change the size of it. You can listen to click events, all cool stuff like that. And it even shows you all the other versions underneath. So one of the downsides, and that's already one of the cons I'm going to show you, of using Angular with Storybook. And that's why Storybook is originally built with React, right? So it's meant for React, it's built for React, and they're now supporting more and more other libraries. But some of the quirky features you see is this kind of stuff, like show code. When I press on show code, I just see this. And I don't know if this makes any sense to you guys, but the only thing it tells me is, okay, the component I'm using is a button, and it can have some arguments. So I can even copy this code, which is absolutely useless, because if I paste this in anywhere, it doesn't really do anything for me, except if I paste it in Storybook, I guess. But it's not very useful. So there are some parts where you really miss the features that are probably already available for React and don't really quite work the way you want them to work in Angular. I hope they improve on that in the future versions of Storybook, but who knows, right? So that's enough of showing some website. I'll show you some code because that's what we're all interested in, right? So what do I get when I look at the code? So when you look at your standard Angular application, which this is a standard Angular application, most people will recognize this. If you start your new Angular project, this is what you get. You get your default app component, you get an app module, some HTML, some Sass files if you choose the Sass way of using CSS. This is what you get. And what does Storybook add? It adds this .storybook folder, which is necessary because in the .storybook folder, it has this main.js, and the main.js tells you where to find the stories, right? It tells you these are the story types of files. It will search in your source folder for all files that ended with stories. Anything of this or anything of that. It has some information about the preview, like you already saw the documentation. It gets imported like this. This is how the documentation gets set up. This is default already implemented for you, so you don't have to think about that. It gives you some TypeScript config, and it gives you some typings. And next to that, it gives you this stories folder, which, depending on what you want, is where you can put it. To be honest, when I create an application, I would probably put all my components under the app or under a folder called component, and in that I would probably put my stories files. But they've done it like this, which is absolutely fine. The only thing I've changed is I've made some subfolders for all the different components, so it doesn't look like it's one big chunk of code. And as you see here, you have some buttons, and this button component is like any default Angular component. There's nothing added to this, and that's the nice thing about Storybook. You don't have to add anything to your own components. You add it externally. You're importing your components instead of changing your components. So this is your standard Angular component with a selector, with some HTML, some CSS, which is external, and some input variables, right? And nothing fancy or crazy around there, nothing extra added. CSS is just like CSS is. Could have been Sass if you use the preloader. And then you get the Storybook part, where they have the button.stories.ts. So these files you could even filter on, and when you're building your package to deploy to Nexus or NPM, you could remove them from your package if you wanted to. It doesn't really matter too much because they won't be loaded anyhow, but you could remove them. So this is what a Storybook story looks like default. So what it always does, it exports a default, and the default tells you something about the title, and the title is actually quite funny. It also automatically creates your navigation structure, because as you can see, I see the example structure button here, I see example, and I see button. If I change this, I, for example, say my awesome nav, and then I add another slash. By adding another slash, it will automatically generate the application, and it will now create a subheader called my awesome nav, in which it has a subfolder called example, in which it has a button, in which all these button different variations are available. So let's remove that because that doesn't make a lot of sense. But it also tells you about the component, the button you should load. It tells you about some of the controls, and it just basically for every single version you want to display, you export a constant. The name of the constant is the one you see here. So if this is primary, it's primary. If I make this whatever, and I also change it here because otherwise it will fill me, it changes my button to whatever. Right? It's still the same button, doesn't do a lot of difference, but at least the title has changed. So you can change all the titles in your navigation based on that. And in this one, it just binds the template, which is just showing the button, and it binds all the arguments which I give here. Right? So I make the primary true, I can make the label button, I can make the size large, I can make it small, etc. So that's basically how a Storybook works here. And there's nothing more to it than that. It's as easy as that. By doing that, you get your stories, you get it displayed, and you get a lot of different versions. So one of the downsides I found about another con I wanted to talk to you about is the reactive input. So here I created a reactive input, which is just a normal input, but I wanted to make it reactive. So I made my reactive input component, and in this TypeScript, I created an input control, which is a form control, which listens to my template and looks for this input, right? So if I wanted to disable this in my code, in normal Angular code, I could just do this, right? I could disable my input and it would be disabled. I can't change the code text anymore, it won't do anything, right? But I don't want to do this in my code because it doesn't need to be disabled by default. I want to disable it from my story. But there's actually not really a way to do that. There's no place where I can put like this argument, I can put this input is disabled. No, I can't, because Storybook is accepting arguments that are template driven and not reactive. This is one of the downsides that I use reactive forms a lot, especially in my project. This does not really help me testing them. Of course, I could make it double, right? I could double up the reactive part as template driven version. So I can change the default values all the same. I could put it in my unit test even if I wanted to, but I would have wanted it here and it doesn't really work. So one of the cool things I mentioned already was that if I get like a button like this, I can press this small button and it goes to an iframe. This iframe URL is already hosted the moment I'm hosting my website, and it just shows my button. It doesn't show anything else. So what I can do is really cool. If I use, in this case, I use Backstop. I don't know if you guys know Backstop, but Backstop is an out-of-the-box UI testing framework. And what does it do? You create a scenario. The scenario is a URL, and it basically goes to that URL, and it takes a screenshot of the page. And if you rerun the whole test, it compares them to the page. So when I run that first time, you run the UI test, which basically says, if I go to my package.json, all the way up. So now to have it in this big font. Yeah, so what the UI test does, it does a backstop test, and it looks for my configuration file. And my configuration file will tell it where all these, how to build up all these URLs. And I have a backstop reference, which are the reference files. So when I run the UI reference, I get a reference file, and it creates a folder in my backstop. In my backstop test run main, it creates bitmap folders, and it creates these screenshots. So this is a screenshot of my button, and this is a button large in mobile version. This is the button in desktop version. This is a highlighted button, etc. So it creates screenshots of all these types of iframes that I created and all these versions of my application. And when I run the UI test command, it will automatically start testing. It will automatically create new screenshots and test them against the existing screenshots to see if they're working or not. I'm going to quickly stop that and show that it actually works by changing some of the code. So if I go to, for example, my button, and I would say, hey, all my buttons are going to have a margin left of 20 pixels all of a sudden, and I rerun my UI test, we're going to see some quite interesting stuff. Because if it all passes, this is what you're going to see in a sec. It's going to pop up this website which says all the designs passed or some of them failed. All the screenshots passed or failed. So as you see here, everything passed when I was trying it out. But now I changed my button, so I expect at least these 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, at least 8 tests to fill. But what you probably see is that more tests are going to fill. It might take a little while, because it does take a while to load all these tests, run all these tests. It just takes a while. I can quickly show you the configuration file that we created for this. I must say shout out to my testing friend at my work. He built most of this, and I just tweaked it to make it work. So he created some really nice code that just looks at my stories, and then based on the name of the stories, it already creates this URL and all these scenarios, and then it exports them all as a scenario, and it creates the two viewports, the mobile and the desktop viewport. And you have to give these bitmap references, like where do you put your bitmap reference, where do you put the tests, where do the HTML reports go, so all the paths are defined here. And then it opens this. And like I said before, I was expecting 8 of them to fail, but in fact, even 11 of them failed. And you can see here why, right? You can see the button was on the left, now it's a bit more to the right, and it shows you the difference. This part was more to the left, this part was more to the right, etc. But if I look further along, I can even see other tests failing, like my header part, where I was expecting this login button to be more to the right. It suddenly is more to the left because I changed the margin. So even if I thought I was only changing my button, I now realize I'm not just changing the CSS in my button, I'm also changing the CSS in my header because it's reusing the button. And this is really nice information. Even if I want this, then I can say, okay, this is correct. I just run the reference again, and then it starts testing against the user reference, which is pretty cool, which is all possible because of the way Storybook works, and Backstop helps a lot. So let's go back to the presentation, because that was my demo. So off to the pros and cons. So one of the pros, of course, is ease of use. It's really easy to use Storybook. It's easy to make these stories. The stories they created in like seconds. I normally write a couple of stories every 10 minutes. The setup is fast. It took me under an hour to get it set up, even in my current working project, which is a little bit more difficult than just running it from a clean slate, of course. But the setup is easy, it's fast, and it integrates really well, even with Angular. It does really well with React. It's also available for Svelte, for web components, for all other kind of new features. There's no need for custom development, so you don't have to build your own navigation bar, you don't have to build your own configuration bar, you don't have to build most of it. You can just actually use your components, display them the way you'd like them. Like I said, it comes with out-of-the-box navigation. It comes with dynamic interaction with props, which is awesome because it makes it more tangible what your components can do. And it comes with out-of-the-box documentation solutions, which a lot of developers don't like documenting. So this is a good feature. The cons, of course, it's written for React. That's one of the major cons I noticed when I was working with it. It's written for React. It can be used in Angular. It works really well in Angular, and it's better than building it yourself in Angular. But you need to know what the downsides are, and you need to accept them before you start developing with it, right? It's hard to change the theme and layout. They're pretty strict to what it looks like at the moment. I can change like the icon of the Storybook icon. I can change some of the color schemes, and I can change the font. But like even like changing the avatar, what's it called, favicon, was hard. It wouldn't really work, even though there were multiple ways to do it according to most posts and blogs online. It wasn't easy to do. It's just hard to change the theme. The template driven is easy, so everything template driven works really well. Reactive is hard. It's not undoable. There are ways to work around it. You could create components in components and start pushing around variables and trying to expose parts of the Angular application that you shouldn't expose, or doesn't need necessarily to be exposed, but it's a lot of extra effort to get it to work, which is actually a shame because you'd want it not to be that hard. And the last, and certainly not the least one, using it with Angular like we did because of time, money, all the different kind of reasons. It means you're in a version, but in a library, but also version locking. What we noticed with Angular, like I said at the beginning, we started with Angular 8. We're still working in Angular 8. And we have like 20 projects at our company. And I think 10 of them or at least 15 of them all work with Angular. So we thought, great, even if we build it in Angular, it could be used across all these platforms. What we didn't realize is we built it in Angular 8, this library, and all these components can't be pushed towards Angular 10 applications because the whole different way of Angular rendering everything and using stuff like that. So now we're kind of locked in the library because anybody using React can't use our components, so they're useless to them. Anybody using Angular needs to be on the same version of us. If they're not on 8, it doesn't work. If they're on 9, if they're on 10, if they upgraded quicker than we did, it won't work. So what do you do then? Do we maintain multiple versions, or do we choose the other way, going to web components like Sven told us with LitElement or whatever other web component framework you'd like to use? So that's about all I had. Are there any questions?
Of course, there are questions.
Good. It feels like I've been talking for at least half an hour. So
I can't confirm that, but it was a good talk. So thank you for that. And I think the first question I wanted to ask you is already answered in your con slide. It was
Yeah.
from Stefan, and I'd still like to see his comment because he has a cute cat avatar. But besides that, he asked, does Storybook out of the box support multiple flavors or themes?
yeah,
And
so it doesn't kind of, right? So it allows you to change the theme a little bit, but not a lot. It's very limited in what it can do there at the moment, and I think that's part of the strength as well. That makes it a lot easier to use it, and making it not too changeable makes it a lot easier to read the code and understand the code and configuration. But to be honest, a lot of developers like me, they like flashy, shiny new things that don't look like the other flashy, shiny new thing. So it'd be cool to be able to adjust it a bit more.
yeah, I agree. And I know even some companies who sort of publicly make their design systems available. And for them, of course, they probably want to brand it in their style as well, right?
Yeah.
So having a big Storybook branding is not really nice for them. Another question, which is close to my heart, because I'm a big Fractal collaborator. I only made one line change, but okay. It was from Daniel, not Polish Daniel, but the one from Haarlem, who asked, what was the main reason you chose Storybook over, for example, Fractal or Pattern Lab?
Yeah, so the reason why we use Storybook is basically because we're using JavaScript components. Everything we build are JavaScript components. There are no CSS parts or only CSS or stuff like that. So we were looking for something that actually integrates really well with Angular, and Storybook at that moment did. We looked a little bit into Fractal. I liked what Fractal had to offer, but it didn't seem as easy as Storybook at the moment. I haven't looked at Pattern Lab, didn't even hear of that until it just got mentioned on this line below me. But that might be cool to look into as well. We just knew that Storybook was a big player in the field of pattern libraries. So we went for Storybook for that reason mainly. And all the cool features, like I said, out of the box, it comes with a lot of nice features, navigation, configuration, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I really like the fact you could change the values in there, like the button name or even the color, because I know in Fractal that is not an out-of-the-box option.
Yeah, so we even had that in our previous version that we built ourselves in Angular, right? We built this component configurator, but we had to make this component configurator for every single component manually and make its own drop downs, its own select box, radio buttons to change stuff and like that. And that was just a lot of extra work. Like I could build like a small little button like under an hour, and it took me another 5 days. Well, 5 days, a bit exaggerated, but it took me another day or two to make the configurator for that button, which is just a waste of time. And with Storybook, you just define what the properties are, and it already automatically does it for you.
Yeah.
Cool. And it depends on the question, right? So we're still using Storybook 5. What I just showed you was Storybook 6. In Storybook 5, you have to configure a little bit more yourself, but it's still very friendly to use. One of the cool things about 5 as well is it has the story source, which I used instead of the copy button. I showed you that in the demo, right? I showed you that you couldn't really copy the code because it's not showing you the code. By using the story source, it actually shows you in the browser the whole source of the code. And out of that, you can actually easily grab the template and easily grab what properties you need to do and what the default values were, etc. I tried it in Storybook 6. I actually added it today to this demo. It doesn't work. It shows you exactly the same as the copy button did. I just showed you, so it was absolutely useless.
A lot of questions are actually about that, because Tom mentions in the Vue variant you can use controls in Storybook for changing attributes, like disabled, on the fly, yada yada. In fact, that is the Angular version of Storybook. Is that the reason that's not possible? I guess it's the same as with the copy button you just mentioned.
So no, it's not the same. So I think what Ton is mentioning towards is the fact that I said it's not working when you try to use reactive tools, because I showed you that it works with the template-driven version, right? Which it also does in Vue. I've not worked with Vue with Storybook, so I might imagine that doing it programmatically, like I tried to do with the disabling it programmatically does not work, or at least it doesn't work as easy. If you do template driven, like most Angular components are, or most people do, it's actually quite easy. Yeah, then it just works out of the box the same as Vue does.
Clear. Annika also asked something on the lines of that, asking if the Vue version of Storybook has the same limitation as Angular has. Do you know something about that?
I would not, honest to God, be able to tell you that. I have not. So I found this out when working with Angular with it. I've been working with it for the last half year, so I've met most of the pros and cons that I needed to find. I haven't worked with it with Vue. I would expect similar limitations, although Vue is more. Yeah, it might not have as much limitations. And now React is completely different because it's all JavaScript driven, right? So it's already thought of from that point of view that everything is in JavaScript and not in CSS, not in HTML templates, etc. So I would expect for Vue to have the same limits, but I don't know. I haven't worked with Vue yet, so I can't tell you.
Well, I heard you build it in about 1 hour. So Annika, I think that's a decent time to find out yourself, maybe if you have some time left.
Yeah, it's easy to do.
Stoffach asked, do the other frameworks also experience this lock-in?
I don't know. I would imagine that there's a lot of issues going from Vue 2 to Vue 3, especially with the TypeScript coming in there. Angular, I think not even between all versions there's an issue, but within Angular 8 and 9, you've got the Ivy renderer added to it, which created this issue basically. So I would say yes, probably, but be careful, right? Even if they don't have it at this moment, they might drastically change it, and it will happen in the future for sure. Because they're not gonna, if they keep up with the same template, everything the same, and everything backwards compatible, at some point they're gonna fall behind the new troops that are going faster, etc. And that's exactly what Angular doesn't do. Angular says, well, every half year we do a major version, and every half year you can expect breaking changes. And by doing that, people try to upgrade as fast as possible. But you also get issues like this, right? You create a generic library which should be future-proof, which is not. So it is, by the way, quite easy to upgrade your components. We did do the upgrade from Angular 8 to 10 already. It didn't take that much of time to do the upgrade. But the problem is then you have to deploy it twice, maintain it twice, make sure that everybody's on Angular 8 can work with it, and everybody on Angular 10 can work with it. And I can imagine with Vue, you have the same issues, or with React, or any of them.
Yeah, clear. I think this is the last framework-related question left from René, who asked, is it already possible to combine multiple frameworks inside one Storybook project? For example, a web component library and an Angular integration with Angular-specific components.
Yeah, so yes and no. That's actually what I've been trying to do today and yesterday, because my next step is to upgrade our Angular library to web components. Yes, you can put web components in the same Storybook as your Angular Storybook version. That's not a problem whatsoever, because it just runs as any other kind of basic component, because it just reacts as JavaScript basically. The problem there I found at the moment is that I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do deployment-wise, right? So at the moment I have all my Angular components in one big repo, which gets shared along, and everybody who uses just picks and out the components that they need. And because Angular already has this tree shaking inside of it, it will discard all the components that are not being used in my package, which is nice, right? Which already works pretty efficient. But I can't ensure that for every single framework that I do tree shaking or that kind of stuff. So when I build my web components, I probably want to go for a repo per web component, right? Create everything separately, like you saw in one of the first pictures. And then also create like a shared component library, which already collaborates all of that and then shows it to the projects that really need everything, that they don't have to import 100 things or 2,000 things, different things all the time. So I'll probably go for something like that. And then I don't really see a world where I easily combine that all in one place with one repo, what I would do is create the same Storybook. So like the Storybook website part, I would probably keep the one Storybook website I have now with my Angular components, just start dropping some web components into there by importing them. And then I have like a separate tab saying, these are the web components. Feel free to use these. If you're using anything else, then Angular 8. Something like that. So I hope that kind of answers your question. But you can. Question is, do you want to? For the displaying part, I would say for sure, because you want one source of truth. For the building part and the repo part, I would say probably not, because you're probably creating a lot of noise.
Yeah, clear to me. I hope that answered the question. I know at least Sven is grateful backstage because he whispered to me that he probably knew an answer. Oh, he's getting on the screen as we speak.
Yes,
Not as shy as we thought.
Done, perfect. I already saw the question and I was like, okay, if he doesn't know, I can help in this one. But Ryan, perfect answer. Spot on.
Oh, for that.
I think we have one question left, if I'm right. At least one from Willem, asking, you said something about exporting Storybook as a package so that your application could use the components. How does that work exactly?
Yeah, so what you have in Angular is called Angular Library. What you just saw was an Angular application. Angular has a built-in library function, which if you generate it with a CLI, it generates a library which you can also package as a library, which is actually quite handy if you're exporting components. So what we did is we kind of dropped the whole app part. We just deleted the whole part of the app and just created the library. The library gets exported separately. And in there, we added a single line of code which filters out all the Storybook files. So we still, whenever we run a build, basically, our pipeline runs, it first picks up the code, right, from the repository. It starts doing all the tests. It does all the UI tests. It runs all the UI tests. If nothing fails, it goes on to the next stage. And that next stage is building it for production. So the one of the part that builds from production is the static website, like I said. And that gets shipped off to some static host deployment. I think it's just SSH'd into some place. And then it gets deployed there, the static website. But then the package itself gets also built like you would normally build a library package with Angular. And it extracts all the parts that you don't need. And it builds the library with just the base components. And it doesn't minify and uglify all the stuff, so you can actually use it and read it when you use it in your components. And then your actual application will, in the end, minify and uglify. And that package gets also deployed, but it gets deployed to, in our case, our Nexus. But in other people's case, it would be another NPM repo or something like that. So more gets published than deployed. Let's say published.
And that's exactly the part you want to use for Sven's talk, right? Because there you want to import them into your micro frontends.
Yeah, for sure. Like at Sven, what they do there at the place that he's working at the moment, they do that all the time, right? They make a lot of builds. Every component gets its own build, and every component gets its own package, and that package gets uploaded somewhere. And all the teams that are using it, they could probably use this one repo where they grab all the packages.
Yeah. So basically, every component has its own development lifecycle, and then the let's say the apps that they are being created, there you can include them inside your project, and then the Storybook app will include everyone.
Yeah, which is cool because it creates a really small, tiny places, and it's really easy to fix bugs. It's really easy to isolate these problems. It's easy to version it. It's just harder to maintain all the versions and to figure out what it all.
That's definitely true, and you end up with what I see. I have a lot of repositories on my local machine.
Yeah, if you build all the components, if you are the component factory team, yeah, you'll have a lot of repos. If you're just building the application, you don't care about that.
I think with that being said, we have a nice full loop tying the two conversations together. So yeah, I want to thank you, Ryan, for the interesting presentation and all the answers you gave.
Yeah.
I see some thank yous in the chat as well. And
thank you, Gabriël, for hosting this stuff. It was really awesome having you chat it all together.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, by the way, for the PowerPoint template. Even though I pretty much ruined it, but it was nice.
Thank you. No worries. You stealing a technique of Sven he just used, asking where everybody's from. I tried to throw you under a bus in a certain WhatsApp group, Ryan, talking about your cap, but I'm not going to make any snarky comment about it. But now I want to know from the audience, what is your favorite Pokemon? Hey.
So by the time people are all answering on this favorite Pokemon thing, this cap is my Corona cap. It's been on me since Corona started. It has not left my head yet. It has been washed a couple of times because it's just easy, right? Live in Corona, working from home, not caring too much about what your hair looks like every day.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah, I see some Pokemon coming in, so that's perfect. I think I'm gonna wrap this up now, or do you guys want to add something still?
Stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe, guys.
Cool. Then, yeah, like I said, this concludes both of our tech talks. This session will become available on this channel as well as the other build evenings are. So make sure to take a look around this channel if you thought this was interesting. Not all subjects are front-end related, but probably there's some other cool IT stuff you want to see, right? So yeah, if you want to be completely up to date about any future build tech talks, make sure to find Capgemini on Meetup. And probably more information on that will be posted in the description below this video as well. And yeah, now the moment I personally waited for all evening. My first time wrapping up an evening in true influencer fashion. If you enjoyed these talks, make sure to leave a like and of course, subscribe to the channel. Thank you all for your time and thanks again Sven and Ryan for the insightful presentation. Hope to see everybody again at one of our next build evenings. Stay safe and good night everybody.